Hey guys, today I'm back with another video about Richard Rorty's book, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. Today I want to cover chapter 1, the contingency of language. At the beginning of the chapter, Rorty lays out that philosophy has taken a shift over the past number of years and it has moved into a postmodern era, which Rorty is a postmodern thinker. So at the beginning of his chapter, he says that he sees art and politics as the subjects that are able to answer questions about ends. Ends meaning, the phrase means to an end. He says that art and politics are what's useful for setting our goals, for reaching the ends that we have. And he contrasts this with saying that science, philosophy, and religion aren't really useful for that purpose anymore. He says that this view of art and politics as answering questions to a means has created a split within philosophy. He says there are those still stuck in Enlightenment rationalism, talking about reason and unreason and all those different things. And he says that the struggle really is because the people from the Enlightenment period still view truth as found rather than created. So here's a paragraph from page 4 of his book about a little bit about what he means about this. So he says, whereas the first kind of philosopher, being the one who still focuses on science and philosophy and religion, contrasts hard scientific fact with the subjective or the metaphor, the second kind sees science as one more human activity rather as the place at which human beings encounter a hard, non-human reality. On this view, great scientists invent descriptions of the world which are useful for purposes of predicting and controlling what happens, just as poets and political thinkers invent other descriptions of it for other purposes. But there is no sense in which any of these descriptions is an accurate representation of the way the world is in itself. These philosophers regard the very idea of such a representation as pointless. To give an example of what Rorty is trying to say here, and hopefully kind of simplify his point, is that he's saying that you have scientists and they describe the world one way. Let's say, you have a biologist who describes molecules and the elements of a molecule and describes nature in all these scientific terms. Then you have an artist who comes along and creates art and describes the world in a new way through their art that isn't this scientific rationalism. And Rorty's basically saying that the scientist and the artist are not more or less correct than the other. They're both correct in their own ways because the scientist has a description about the world that's useful for doing science, for creating technology, for discovering medicine, etc. And then you have the artist who's creating descriptions about the world that are useful for aesthetics and creating new types of art. And there's not really a more true description of the world. And so I'm using the word true, and so I want to read what exactly Rorty means by when he says true and when he's talking about the world out there versus truth being out there. So in his book, he says, we need to make a distinction between the claim that the world is out there and the claim that the truth is out there. To say that the world is out there, that is not our creation, is to say with common sense that most things in space and time are the effects of causes which do not include human mental states. To say that truth is not out there is to simply to say that where there are no sentences, there is no truth. That sentences are elements of human language and that human languages are human creations. Truth cannot be out there, cannot exist independently of the mind, because sentences cannot so exist or be out there. The world is out there, but descriptions of the world are not. Only descriptions of the world can be true or false. The world on its own, unaided by the describing activities of human beings, cannot. And so here Rorty is presenting a semantic theory of truth, where he's saying that truth is only found within language. And I was very, very intrigued by this idea, and I was trying to think of an example again to try to simplify this idea, or at least make more sense. See, Rorty wants to say that truth isn't out there for a couple different reasons, and one reason is that descriptions, again, aren't more true or less true than another description. So I thought of, just take a tree for example, okay, and think about a tree. So if I say, hey, that's a tree, and you agree with me because, we have the same language, we understand each other, you say, yeah, that's a tree, you're right, that's true. If I then say, that's a large plant with roots and leaves and bark, and then you say, yeah, that's true. Well, both descriptions are true, right? If I say that's a tree, or I say that's a large plant with bark and leaves and roots. But then Rorty wants to say, well, which one's more true? Is there one that's more true? And Rorty would say, no, there's not one that's more true than the other. We're not getting at the intrinsic nature of a tree by describing it in a way that talks about its roots or its bark or its leaves. And what this really does is puts you in either an expansionist dilemma or a reductionist dilemma, and kind of what that means. So if you were to take a reductionist dilemma, then and you were to ask, well, what would be the intrinsic nature of a tree? Well, you could just keep reducing it down to, well, you have the tree, but then you have the bark, but then you have the cells, then you have the atoms, then you have the quantum, and so what exactly is this nature of a tree? It's just made up of atoms like any other thing made out of similar atoms. And so Rorty in this first chapter wants to get rid of this idea that we can use language to describe the world out there in a way that the world wants to be described, or that is more or less true or false than previous descriptions. He wants to move past this idea that language is a medium, which I will get to in a little bit. So because Rorty sees language as a practical way of describing the world, he basically, instead, when he argues, he doesn't want to prove people wrong. He wants to instead shift the conversation and say, hey, think about it this way instead. So he kind of talks about in his book a little bit that he would not try to disprove the correspondence theory of truth, because if he did, he would have to join the language game of a person who believes correspondence theory of truth, and then try to dismantle that theory through that language game. And he says that I can't do that. But what I can do is I can use language in a way that can convince you that my way of using language is better than your way of using language. And so Rorty believes that there's no intrinsic nature to the world out there. There's no truth out there waiting to be discovered. He says that's an idea that's left over from an age that still thinks metaphysically or theologically. He says that we think that way, or we thought that way because we thought that a God created everything, and that God spoke a specific language and thus created a nature that we could objectively discover. So another problem is not only are our descriptions of the world, there's no way to determine whether one is more true or less true, thus implying that we can't ever reach a nature about nature, is that our perception of nature is mind dependent. And so the colors that we see, the textures that we feel, the smells that we smell are all dependent on our mind. And so if you're colorblind and I say the grass is green, then you don't know what I'm talking about. Or other creatures outside of humanity, they see different colors, or they see different wavelengths, they hear different sounds, they're able to hear higher pitch sounds, lower pitch sounds, they're able to taste different things. And so we have absolutely no hope of finding any type of intrinsic nature within nature. And so Rorty just kind of sees this as a pointless pursuit. Okay, so Rorty has argued that there is no nature out there and there's no nature within that language can get to or achieve or describe better than the other. And so then he argues about the contingency of language, about how the language that we have and the language that we use has just come around by mere time and chance. And he argues that on the basis of that, there is no deliberate decision to switch from one language to another. For example, it was not humanity's goal 1,000 years ago to reach political systems such as fascism or socialism or capitalism or democracy. This wasn't a goal. It was just something that happened by time and chance, by every little event that happened. It eventually progressed. People started speaking a new language, and that's kind of the same with languages. You know, there is no goal for a language, right? We stop using words because they stop becoming useful. We stop speaking in a certain way because it is no longer useful. And so then Rorty says in his book, he says, I shall try to show how a recognition of that contingency leads to a recognition of the contingency of conscious, and how both recognitions lead to a picture of intellectual and moral progress as a history of increasingly useful metaphors rather than of increasing understanding of how things really are. So what Rorty means by metaphor here is a sentence that doesn't have a literal meaning. And he views metaphors as basically just nonsensical, because if you use a metaphor and somebody doesn't understand what it means, you have to use literal language to explain what it means. But Rorty says there are metaphors that are useful, and eventually they get explained with literal language so much everybody understands the metaphor, and it no longer becomes a metaphor, and it is then literal language. And so Rorty sees this process of language as having no goal. There is no human nature or external nature. Truth is found within these sentences. And then this language has just kind of developed by time and chance through the dying off of old metaphors and forming new metaphors. And these metaphors stick around because they're useful. And so there's been this constant refining of language, and this constant refining of our usefulness, the truth within language, truth not with a capital T. And so he views moral progress as language that is more and more useful, which is probably a really strange concept to kind of wrap your head around if you're thinking from this Enlightenment rationalist mindset. But try to put yourself in this postmodern mindset of viewing truth as a product of language. So now I want to talk about the medium that I mentioned earlier. And so Rorty defines a medium as something standing between the self and the non-human reality with which the self seeks to be in touch. And he says we should not view language this way. We should not view language in a way that it is seeking to be perfected in a way to be in touch with some non-human reality. And he says the reasons for this is because we're still stuck in skepticism, realism, and idealism, which Rorty wants to step out of. And when you're still stuck in those systems of thinking, Rorty presents questions that come up in those modes of thinking that cannot be answered. And those questions, he says, does the medium between the self and the reality get them together or keep them apart? Should we see the medium primarily as a medium of expression, of articulating what lies deep within the self, or should we see it as primarily a medium of representation, showing the self what lies outside it? And then he says, idealist theories of knowledge and romantic notions of the imagination can, alas, easily be transposed from the jargon of consciousness into that of language. Realistic and moralistic reactions to such theories can be transposed equally easily. So the seesaw battles between romanticism and moralism, and between idealism and realism, will continue as long as one thinks there is hope of making sense of the question of whether a given language is adequate to a task, either the task of properly expressing the nature of the human species or the task of properly representing the structure of non-human reality. And he wants to get off that seesaw, and he thinks that the philosopher Davidson helps him do that. And Davidson is very similar to Wittgenstein. They stop viewing language as a medium, which gets rid of the expansionist, reductionist problem that I had mentioned earlier. Because of this, Davidson and Wittgenstein view language as a tool rather than a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, as Rorty says. And so if you view it as a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, then certain languages fit into certain places, or certain descriptions fit into correct places. And Rorty says that we should view language as a tool, something that is useful for us. He says that if we view language as a jigsaw puzzle, we will be tempted to ask questions such as this. What is the place of consciousness in a world of molecules? Are colors more mind-dependent than weights? What is the place of value in a world of fact? What is the place of intentionality in a world of causation? What is the relationship between the solid table of common sense and the unsolid table of microphysics? Or what is the relation of language to thought? He says we should not try to answer such questions, for doing so leads either to the evident failures of reductionism or to the short-lived successes of expansionism. We should restrict ourselves to questions like, does our use of these words get in the way of our use of other words? This is a question about whether our use of tools is inefficient, not a question about whether our beliefs are contradictory. Another way that Rorty wants us to think about language is the same way that we think about evolution. It just came around by chance. It filled different niches. It filled different needs within the environment. And that's exactly what our language does. It fills different needs. There is no ultimate goal or ultimate purpose. It's useful to us, and that is what Rorty wants us to see. Now, he's using all this about language to set up his next two chapters, the contingency of selfhood and the contingency of community. So if there isn't really a human nature or anything of what it means to be human, and there's not any truth out there waiting to be discovered, rather we create truth ourselves through our language, and we use that language because it's useful, then this sets up what he is eventually going to talk about in part 2 of his book, Irony, which is all about self-creation. If there's not a human nature, we can describe ourselves in ways that are true and create ourselves in a way that we want to be described. This contingency of language allows us to create communities just like it does with ourselves. And so, again, this first chapter is very important for Rorty as it sets up the entirety of the rest of the book. His entire argument rests on chapter 1 of his book. It is the foundation of the rest of his book. I want to end this video with reading the last 2 paragraphs of chapter 1 of Rorty's book. He says, I can crudely sum up the story which historians like Bloomberg tell by saying that once upon a time we felt a need to worship something which lay beyond the visible world. Beginning in the 17th century, we tried to substitute a love of truth for a love of God, treating the world described by science as a quasi-divinity. Beginning at the end of the 18th century, we tried to substitute a love of ourselves for a love of scientific truth, a worship of our own deep spiritual or poetic nature treated as one more quasi-divinity. The line of thought common to Bloomberg, Nietzsche, Freud, and Davidson suggests that we try to get to the point where we no longer worship anything, where we treat nothing as a quasi-divinity, where we treat everything, our language, our conscience, our community, as a product of time and chance. To reach this point would be, in Freud's words, to treat chance as worthy of determining our fate. In the next chapter, I claim that Freud, Nietzsche, and Bloom do for our conscience what Wittgenstein and Davidson do for our language, namely, exhibit its sheer contingency. If you're enjoying Rorty's book, leave a like on this video. Leave a comment if you have any questions or critiques or anything you want to talk about with Rorty's book. I tried to sum it up the best I could. It really is a very complicated read. I highly suggest this book and reading it for yourself. I love it. It is a great philosophical work. If you haven't already, click that subscribe button. Stick around for more philosophy videos. Until the next one, bye-bye. No.